welcome to The Kill File, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany, and each week we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown, because in The Kill File, nothing stays buried forever.
Once I'm back with him, say, hey, you went out there against your will. But if, you get back and, you take them back to where they want to go and say, hey, I know you're fucking pissed off at me, you're mad. You'd like to, if you had a gun right now, you want to blow my head off or whatever. So I said, you're back, you're a prostitute. It's your word against mine. I'm going to deny if you ever bring any charges against me on it.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Kill File. Today is episode number 9. Yay! Today we're going to talk about a nasty little man named Robert Bob Hansen. He will be known as Bob. He was also known as the Butcher Baker. I hadn't heard of this story before finding it for today, and it was an interesting one. Today's trigger warnings are going to be typical, so trigger warnings for murder. One victim was shy of being 18, which means she was a child victim. Other triggers include rape, sexual assault, abduction, and the story is also about sex workers in case that triggers anyone. So let's jump in. Bob was born in Estersville, Iowa in 1939, and he was born to Christian and Edna Hansen. Christian was said to be a, quote, big old mean guy who was overbearing and Danish. He was an immigrant baker. Bob's childhood wasn't exactly easy. It was said that he would work very long hours in his family's bakery from a very young age. It said that his father expected him to work every morning starting at 2 a.m. even on school days. Bob was said to be a shy and thin young boy, and he had also had a horrible stutter. This left him quite the loner at school. It also said that he was naturally left-handed, but had been forced to use his right hand instead. As his face was full of acne and then afterwards scars, he was bullied in school because of this, and in turn this didn't help his stutter at all. He was ignored in school by all of the pretty girls, and Bob would fantasize at this young age about seeking revenge. Bob's father was said to be domineering himself, which left the quiet, loner young Bob with a somewhat dysfunctional relationship with his father. There was, however, one hobby that Bob loved to escape into. Here, no one would tease him, make fun of him, or try to control him. This hobby? Well, it was hunting, of course. He was said to channel his quote-unquote rage and fantasies of vengeance into this sport, as he would stalk animals. In 1957, Bob would enlist in the United States Army Reserve, and a year later, he would be discharged. After his discharge, he worked at a police academy back in Iowa as a drill instructor. When he was there in Iowa, Bob would meet a woman that was younger than him, and then they would go on to get married in 1960. While Bob and his young wife were living in Pocahontas, Iowa, Bob said he felt mistreated by his own community and decided to retaliate. It was said that he had convinced one of the young bakery employees to help him burn down a garage full of school buses. Unfortunately for Bob, the younger employee had somewhat of a conscience and turned himself and Bob in for the crime. Bob was arrested in December of 1960 in the county of Pocahontas for arson. After this, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He would only end up serving a year and 8 months before he was released. Bob's wife had filed for divorce while he was in prison, which left him feeling alone while he was serving his sentence. Maybe he shouldn't have set a garage full of school buses on fire? Duh. He would also end up being arrested many times for small thefts over the next few years. By the year of 1967, Bob had remarried, and him and his wife, Darla, and their 2 children moved to Anchorage, Alaska. Bob was a man that was well-liked by his community, and he had also competed in local competitions in hunting, and had set a bunch of hunting records for them. It was said after Bob had reported a robbery at his own home and collected a sum of $13,000 in insurance money, he opened up his own bakery. A pastor named Wayne Coggins, who had known Bob when he became the pastor at the local church, said that he never saw, quote, unquote, Bob's darker side that would arise later on. He said that Bob just seemed like a regular guy who owned a bakery, and the pastor often saw him because he himself was a fan of donuts. The pastor said Bob didn't really attend church, but his wife Darla was very faithful. Darla was said to be a Sunday school teacher who was beautiful and well-spoken and was good at teaching kids with dyslexia how to read. A friend of Bob's named Marshall Ellison met Bob through his wife Darla, who had approached Marshall and his wife at church to ask if they would like to come over for dinner. She had explained that Bob didn't really have any friends and wanted to know if Marshall would consider being friends with Bob. She thought that Marshall and Bob would have something in common since they were both avid hunters. Marshall had actually been taken on Bob's airplane so they could hunt for larger animals. He said it wasn't weird for people in Alaska to have planes, and then went on to say that you could hunt from the different roads out there, but the roads were where all the people were. So if you wanted to get bigger animals, you would need to fly somewhere. On a show that I watched about Robert Hansen called Mind of a Monster, The Butcher Baker, Bob was recorded saying, quote, "I've flown an untold amount of hours throughout the whole south part of the state here. I loved it. You can be out there and never see a soul all day long." One of the hunters that Marshall had known once went with Bob hunting and spent the day with him. Except when this hunter returned, he told Marshall that he was uncomfortable hunting with Bob. He said that people like himself and Marshall liked to hunt because they liked being outdoors, stalking the animal, and that they enjoyed the animals whether they were shooting at them or not. But he did not feel like Bob was like that. He said he felt Bob liked to hunt because he enjoyed the kill. When Bob, this seemingly mild-mannered and quiet family man and baker, had started a horrific killing spree, no one suspected him. Bob was said to love his kids a lot and had been known to be very kind to them, which doesn't surprise me. I've heard this time and time again that no one suspects these sickos of doing heinous acts, because to your face, they are good at keeping up this facade of being a good father or a good guy or whatever. We need to stop picturing these killers as monsters and that they look so scary and that you would immediately recognize them and know that they are a creepy killer, because it's just not the case most of the time. It was said there were a few cracks in Bob's facade when he was arrested twice in 1972 for the abduction and attempted rape of a quote-unquote housewife, and then again for raping sex workers. See, right here is another example of the justice system failing the community it is sworn to protect. Hello, he already raped someone and abducted another woman? Why was he not locked up for a very, very long time? In the years 1973 to the year 1984, Bob would go on to kill sex workers and dancers in the Anchorage area. He would pretend to want their services, but instead, he would often abduct and rape them. He would sometimes even fly these sex workers in his plane to a cabin that he owned near the Kinnick River. Out where Bob would land his plane, there was something called a quote-unquote meat shack that had chains and poles that were used to hang the wild game that was hunted. This is where one would strip the animal of its pelt or whatever and take the meat that they may want to eat. There was one time when Bob had abducted a woman, landed his plane near his cabin, and taken the woman and chained her inside the meat shack. This is when he heard another plane approaching the area. He said he panicked a little and thought that they may land by him and he didn't want to have to shoot the person. He went outside of the meat shack to look at the plane that ended up flying by the area, circling and flying close again, and on the second flyby, Bob said he, quote, didn't want to have to shoot the son of a bitch. Bob then said the plane tipped its wings at him, to which Bob waved at the pilot, and then the plane leveled off and headed down the river. Once Bob would arrive with the lady of his choice out near his cabin, he would then sometimes make these women run through the woods naked, and he would hunt them. Yes, like full-on hunting for deer, except for people. Sick. He would, of course, eventually kill them with a knife or his rifle. Bob was not completely unnoticed, as it was later shown on court documents that Bob was arrested for assault with a dangerous weapon, and for larceny in 1976. He apparently stole a chainsaw, but again only had to serve minimal time. He was said to have appealed his sentence of 5 years for the larceny and then was released upon his appeal. It pisses me off that he was given more time for the chainsaw being stolen than for the abduction or rape and attempted rape of another. Great. Bob's first victim was said to be a topless dancer or sex worker who Bob propositioned, and while she was in his car, he pulled a gun on her. It was then said he stabbed her in the neck and then proceeded to bury her in a shallow grave. Bob would later end up confessing to raping 30 different women in the 70s and 80s. The first body that was found in connection to Bob was an unidentified woman who was later on nicknamed Eklutna Annie because of where they found her shallow grave. It was on a street called Eklutna Lake Road. This woman's body was found by construction workers on the 21st of July in the year of 1980. This had me curious how many times construction workers have uncovered bodies in their line of work. It was impossible to identify this woman's body due to being in the elements for so long. There had been significant animal damage as well. So needless to say, her body was in severe decomposition at the time that she was found. There was a facial reconstruction done and it was publicized very broadly, but no one identified her. To this day, she remains unidentified. It's sad. In the same month of July, there was another body that was found of a topless dancer named Joanne Messina, and her body had been found in a gravel pit. Her body was also badly decomposed, which provided very little evidence that could be useful in her case. A man named John Daly, who was a police officer with the Anchorage Police Department, said he was going out on September 12, 1982, to hunt moose along the Knik River when they stumbled upon something that looked odd. He said there was an indent in the snow that looked weird, and when they approached it, they could see snow mixed with clothing, and then under the denim clothing, they could see some skin. As they dug, he said the odor of decomposition was getting stronger. The body of Sherry Morrow was found also in a shallow grave along the Knik River. When they had uncovered her body, they had noticed on her skeletal remains that around her head was still wrapped an ace bandage covering her eyes. This woman had been missing since November 17, 1981. Despite the fact that she had been shot 3 times in the back, there were no bullet holes found in her clothes, which suggested that the killer redressed her after he shot her dead. What a freaking weirdo. It was around this time in October of 1982 that a woman named Maxine Famel, who was a homicide unit police officer with a psychology degree under her belt, started putting together the thought that many of these missing girls and dead bodies could be connected. She was one of only 2 females in the department. She was starting to piece together that they had a serial killer on their hands. She said that no one believed her, and they all thought that she was a woman, so she was stupid. She said on her interview, "I was not stupid." Bob was quoted saying on the recording, quote, "I guess I was getting bolder and bolder." A man named Glenn Flothy was an Alaskan state trooper, and this man went to Maxine because he was on some of the cases of the missing women, and he created a task force about the missing women and the deceased women that were being found. One victim was found along the Knik River on September 2nd, 1983. It was a body of a 17-year-old young woman named Paula Golding, who was said to have been only in Anchorage for 1 week when she came there from Hawaii. She, too, had been redressed after she was shot to death. Her roommate was a woman named Robin Burkhart, who was at the time in the Air Force. She said that Paula was a dancer for a specific company, but only to get to the next place. Her roommate said that Paula was not thrilled about being a dancer, it was more of just a stepping stone. She also said Paula was so nervous her first time dancing that she was only able to remove her top. Her roommate had said that she believed Paula had only gotten nude 1 time during the week of dancing, and it just happened to be the night that Bob was at the club. Robin recalled that she had seen Bob at the club and that he came off to her as a creep. She said the next day Paula was really excited when she came up to her roommate and asked if she remembered the man from the night before, to which Robin did, of course. Paula then said Bob had told her he wanted to fly her out to a quote-unquote modeling shoot, and that Paula had been really excited about this opportunity and thought that this could be her way out of dancing. Robin said she then walked Paula to her daytime date and that this was the last time anyone had seen or heard from Paula. There wouldn't be another body found until April 24th, 1984. The woman who was found deceased was named Sue Luna. At this point, the victim didn't have a known time of disappearing or time of death. This woman was taken to the river made to strip down before Hansen hunted her down and shot her to death. So gross. And the fact that he made them not only run naked, which is humiliating, but also maybe gave them that glimmer of hope that they could get away from him if they ran hard enough, made me sick to my stomach. A woman named Karen O'Leary ended up dating Bob Hansen a little during one summer when Bob had sent his family on vacation to Europe without him. Which that in itself is kind of weird, but okay. It was said Bob took out what was said to be a personal ad in the local newspaper that came out on Sundays. A kind of online dating before there was an online. Karen responded to his ad and they ended up on a date. Karen said she felt bad for Bob because of his stutter. One of the days that Bob was on a date with Karen, it had been too windy to fly, so Bob took her to his house. She had no idea how lucky she was that it was too windy that day. When they arrived at Bob's house, she said as soon as he walked through the door, their family dog ran and hid from Bob. Karen thought that it was odd that his own dog would hide from him like that. She said there had been trophies of animal heads all over his house. And when he took her to the basement den, which she referred to as his sort of man cave, Bob asked her if she would like to make love to him on the bearskin rug. To which she replied, no. Bob did not hurt this woman for reasons we can speculate later on. Bob was able to abduct another victim on the 13th of June in 1983, but this woman was able to escape. A woman named Cindy Paulson, who had been 17 at the time, was offered $200 to perform oral sex on Bob. When she had agreed and then gotten into his vehicle, he pulled a gun on her. Bob then drove her back to his house and proceeded to keep her captive in his quote-unquote man cave, where he tortured, raped, and sexually assaulted her. She said in her interview he wanted to have sex on the bearskin rug. He then chained Cindy to a post in his basement and used a chain that he looped twice around her neck. Then, Bob took a nap on the couch. Yeah, he must have been so exhausted from all the torture he did to this poor young woman. What a fucker. After he awoke, he told Cindy that she was so good and so cooperative that he was going to take her to the cabin and then bring her back. Bob said in his tape that he, quote, told her the truth. He told her he was going to take her to the cabin and that they would just spend the weekend together. Cindy said in an interview she told him that she just wanted to go home. Because she lived with her mom, she would never tell anyone. She was crying and said she knew that she was never going to make it back home. Bob put Cindy in his car and he drove to the airfield. This is where his plane was, and he told her that they were going to the cabin that was near the Kanik River in a valley called Matsunaka Susitna, and this was said to be about 35 miles north of Anchorage. Cindy said that Bob told her he needed to put her seat in so he could tie her up in the plane. She then said she knew she wasn't going to live. She said after what this man had done to her, she knew he had to kill her. It was heartbreaking to hear this young woman recount of what happened to her. I can't even imagine that feeling of hopelessness or pure terror. While Bob was busy getting things ready with the plane, Cindy was able to escape somehow while she still had on one handcuff and she took off running. She said Bob started chasing her with the gun. She had left her shoes in the vehicle, and this would actually be used as evidence later, so she was running barefoot in the snow. She then hauled ass to a street and was able to flag down a truck for help. Yes, girl, good for you. A man named Bob Yount was the driver of the truck, who was said to be in shock at how this woman looked because she was naked with one handcuff on, so he pulled over and let her in. Good for you, Bob. The good Bob, not the bad Bob. Yount ended up dropping Cindy off at a place called the Mush Motel. That's a great motel name. Yeah, I'm going to be staying at the Mush Motel. Yes. When Cindy was dropped off there, she tried to get the clerk to call her boyfriend. In the meantime, Yount called the police so he could report the incident. When the police arrived to the end, they had discovered that Cindy had left in a taxi to be taken to her boyfriend, who was at the Big Timber Motel. Who gets to name these motels? Because I love them. The officers found her there, and she was still wearing the handcuffs. They then took her down to the police station for her statement. As they headed there, Cindy was able to point out to the authorities Bob's plane as they passed the Merrill airfield. An officer had called the airfield and asked who the plane's tail number belonged to, and the airfield then told the authorities it was Bob Hansen's plane. She proceeded to tell them the details of how he held her hostage, raped her, and tortured her repeatedly. She was crying and telling the police that she knew if Bob had gotten her in that plane, that she would never be seen again. One officer was interviewed saying he could tell that Cindy was very distraught and that she had been afraid that he would kill her and that her body would never be found out there somewhere. Authorities then brought in Bob Hansen to question him as well. Bob apparently tried to pass the story off, saying Cindy was just a sex worker who had been upset and tried to get more money from him. What an ass. But it gets worse. It said because of Bob's meekness and the fact that he was well liked in the community, coupled with the fact that a friend of his corroborated his alibi, they let him go. Even though they knew that he had been priorly arrested for abduction and rape. What the hell? One officer said that he actually believed Cindy, but that the investigator believed Bob. Not long after this, Bob tried to kidnap a woman at gunpoint, but because the woman screamed bloody murder, her roommate called the police. The police at this time had decided it was about time that they make what they referred to as a sex offender book, and they said that Bob Hansen's picture was the first put into the book for the authorities. They believed that Bob was going to try and rape that woman. While Bob was out on bond, he again abducted a woman at gunpoint and raped her. This woman said she thought for sure she was going to die. She was said to have convinced him to bring her back safely, and after he left, she went straight to the authorities and picked Bob's picture out without hesitation. I tried to find out how she was able to convince him to bring her back, but I couldn't. I was so curious what this woman said to him, but whatever it was, good for her. Bob told police, though, that this woman, whose name was Patty Robinson, that she was just a sex worker who had wanted more money. Unfortunately, at this point, the authorities made a deal with Bob that they would drop the charges against him for the Patty Robinson case if he would agree to plead no contest to a few of the other charges against him. Bob had admitted to the authorities during his confession recording that he believed sex workers were beneath him, that he could do things with these women that he could never do with a, quote, good woman. Gross. So here's a list of victims, and it says that this is either around the time they were murdered or the time they were found. December 22nd, 1971 was a 17-year-old girl named Celia. July 7th, 1973, a 17-year-old girl named Megan. July 5th, 1975, a 23-year-old woman named Mary. June 28th, 1980, a 24-year-old named Roxanne. July 1980, a 24-year-old named Joanne. July 21st, 1980, a gluten Annie, and she was said to be aged between 16 and 25 years old. September 6th, 1980, a 41-year-old named Lisa. November 17th, 1981, a 24-year-old named Sherry. December 2nd, 1981, unknown age named Andrea. May 26th, 1982, a 23-year-old named Sue. April 25th, 1983, a 17-year-old named Paula. April 25th, 1984, unknown age named Dylan. April 26th, 1986, unknown age named Teresa. April 26th, 1984, a 24-year-old named Angela. And April 29th, 1984, a 19-year-old named Tamara. There was also two other known victims who were said to be killed between 1980 and 1983. A Jane Doe that they couldn't identify, and a 28-year-old woman named Malay. I also read in a recent article that came out in October of 2021 that the remains of one of his victims that had been apparently gone by the name Horseshoe Harriet for 37 years was finally identified as a woman named Robin. They were able to use public genealogy databases, and authorities were able to generate a new DNA profile for her and use her family tree to figure out her identity. Technology. I absolutely love it where we are with this stuff right now. CODIS? Yes, big fan. After 3 bodies had been discovered, the authorities ended up contacting the FBI to ask for help with establishing a profile of this killer. The profiler was able to determine that the killer would be, quote, an experienced hunter, have a history of rejection by women, have low self-esteem, may stutter, and was likely to keep souvenirs from each murder. Most likely, jewelry, end quote. It blows my mind that profilers are able to figure the things out that they are about these killers. That's freaking awesome. I wonder if I would like that job. With all the information from the profiler, the head detective on the case was able to take another look at the potential suspects when he realized Bob Hansen fit the profile. So because the FBI gave the profile and then because of Cindy's original testimony about how this man abducted her, the authorities sent a request for a warrant to search Bob Hansen's home, cars, and airplane. They searched his home while they had brought him in for questioning. At first, Bob was denying anything and everything. When one of the interviewers had finished with Bob because he had asked for an attorney, the interviewer drove straight to Bob's house to help in the search. They were afraid that if they didn't find anything, they would not be able to bring charges to Bob for abduction, rape, and murder of these women that they knew he was guilty of. On October 27th, during the search, the authorities were able to find Bob's collection of rifles that he apparently had hid up in the attic on a section of insulation that he probably thought no one would ever find. One was said to be a .223 caliber rifle that was later confirmed to be the murder weapon. Right before the authorities were going to give up on the search, one officer pulled back a section of insulation near the opening of the attic, and there laid a baggie of jewelry. They brought Maxine to the bag of jewelry, to which she immediately knew that this was the jewelry that had belonged to several of the victims. Then, get this, hidden in Bob's bedroom, hidden behind Bob's headboard, they found a map of the area marked all over the place with small X's. While Bob was arrested and sitting in jail, he had asked the pastor to come see him. When Bob entered the room where the pastor was, he asked one question. He asked, quote, "What kinds of sins does God forgive?" To which the pastor replied that he believed God would forgive everything except blasphemy. Apparently, Bob then knocked on the door towards the guards and told him he was done. 2 days later, he confessed. In the beginning, he tried to say that it was all of the women's fault. He said his intention was to let these women back into the world and tried to somehow justify his actions. He said as long as they went along with what he wanted, then she would go home and that was it. When the investigator asked, "And what if they don't?" Bob said, "Then they stayed."
As long as things were, she would go along with what I wanted out there, okay? Go home and that was it.
And if they didn't?
They stayed.
What an ass. Don't blame the victims, you fuck. Even the DA assistant who was taking his confession said the same thing. That him blaming the victims, or at least trying to, was absolutely ludicrous. Bob said she had to play out his fantasy, but if she had come out and said that it would cost him money, then they would no longer be a quote-unquote decent girl. Frank Rothschild, who worked for the DA, took Bob's confession. Rothschild said in Bob's eyes, if the girl was interested in him, then they were a good girl, and he acted different with women who were actually interested in him. But they would be considered a bad girl if they wanted money, and it meant that he thought he could do anything he wanted with them. Bob only gave confessions at first to the ones that he knew they had him on, and then he said, that's it. Rothschild said, if they had folded at this time, then Bob would have lived out the rest of his years thinking that he won and thinking that he beat the authorities. However, the authorities knew they had a map with over 20 X's on it. Rothschild said he was staring right at Bob's face when they said that each of these X's led authorities to believe that each one of these had been a grave site for each of his victims. When they said this to Bob, Rothschild said he could see that Bob's face changed. He said at this point is when he saw not Bob the baker, but Bob the serial killer for the first time. Oh, it creeped me out the way he said it. This is when Bob finally admitted to the fact that he had been killing women since 1971. When authorities would point to each of the X's on Bob's map, he would tell them stories about each of them. He ended up confessing to 17 murders and for raping another 30 women. The authorities were able to use ballistics evidence to link the bullets found at the crime scenes to Bob's rifle. Bob eventually agreed to a plea bargain when even more evidence was presented against him. It said that in exchange for Bob serving his sentence in a federal prison, he agreed to plead guilty to 4 of the murders, the ones that authorities had solid and clear evidence for, and Bob also had to provide information on the other victims. Alaska didn't have the death penalty, so the exchange was for him to serve his sentence at a federal prison where there would be less of a chance for him to run into the families of his victims, is what he said. What a coward. Bob said, as to a motive for his awful acts, that he wanted to kill women because they had rejected him for all of his life. Ugh, what a stupid reason to kill people because they rejected you. We're all rejected at some point in our lives, and it sucks, but you deal with it and you move on. It is not an excuse for murder. Sorry, but no. As part of his deal, Bob also had to explain the X marks on the map that had been given to investigators. Bob then showed the authorities 17 different grave sites, but there was still 3 marks on the map unaccounted for, and Bob refused to give the information. The authorities suspected that these could be the graves of Megan Emmerich, Mary Thill, and the third unidentified person. Bob had denied responsibility for the murders of either Thill or Emmerich. Pleading guilty to 4 of the murders was enough to get him convicted and sentenced to a total of 461 years in prison, and he would not be eligible for parole. In the spring of 1990, Bob was apparently moved from the Lemon Creek prison that was located in Juneau to a maximum security facility in Seward called Spring Creek that was located about 120 miles southwest of Anchorage. See, Bob was apparently planning an escape from Lemon Creek because he had been secretly collecting materials, which included some aeronautical maps. Ugh, yuck, that is freaking scary. I am so glad they moved him. Another tidbit about this I found interesting. I guess there's a movie about this story that I didn't know, and I need to watch it. It's on my list. It's called The Frozen Ground. It was apparently made in 2013. It says here that John Cusack plays Bob Hansen and Nicolas Cage plays the sergeant. So I am definitely going to watch that one. If you guys have seen it, let me know what you thought. Bob died on August 21st, 2014 from a health condition that was ongoing, the nature of which was not disclosed. One source said it was just natural causes, but I'm not sure if that's the case or not. I couldn't get confirmation either way. And that, my friends, is the sickening, sad, scary case of Robert Hansen. Baker, rapist, killer, and all-around giant piece of shit. I want to know where this mentality that we often see, either through the authorities or people in general, that sex workers or dancers aren't as much of a person as other people are. I hope that this is no longer the case, but I heard not long ago there was a story about a woman who went missing. And this was back in just 2016. And because she had had some run-ins with the law and some prior drug abuse problems, the authorities refused to search for her when she went missing. Her family had claimed that she had been clean for 6 months, but they told her family that they just considered her relapsing and they wouldn't even help her family look for her or work on the case at all. It came out later that she was murdered and she had been abducted. It was sickening to hear that they wouldn't help. I was trying to look at it from the other side of the perspective, as I usually do. And I thought, well, maybe when someone is an addict and they live those more risky lifestyles, the police get to the point where they can't use so much manpower looking for people that maybe don't want to be found because they're using, I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you agree that the police shouldn't look for people who are addicts and live that kind of risky lifestyle who may have disappeared due to drug use, or do you think that they should be looking for them anyways and trying to help these people? I honestly can see both sides. What a tough issue. It's just another reason to never do drugs. Just say no. Anyways, share your thoughts on the Kill Files Facebook page. You can comment on Spotify if that's where you're listening, or any of the socials. Also, don't forget to reach out with comments, suggestions, or if you have any cases you want me to check out. I got my first case suggestion the other day and I was so excited. It's only been a few weeks of doing this, but those moments are the absolute best. Hearing people say that I'm killing it or that they like my voice or whatever has just been absolutely lovely. So thank you guys for that. You know, being a podcaster is scary. It makes me feel very vulnerable and just out there. So I appreciate you guys engaging with me and sharing your thoughts. It means more than you know. All right, I will catch you guys next week for a new episode. Bye. Well, that's it for today, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today and listening to another episode of The Kill File. If you want to share your thoughts on what we covered today, suggest a case for me to check out, or if you're just bored and looking for something to do, you can head over to The Kill File's social medias and reach out. We're on Facebook and Instagram as The Kill File, and we're on YouTube and TikTok as The Kill File Podcast. Also, feel free to check out our website at thekillfile.com, where you can learn more about me, your host, and a little bit more about how The Kill File got started. I love hearing from you guys. Come back on Mondays, wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, when we will cover another case on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye!